Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
Gentlemen, I suggest you work some changes to your proposal before you give it to the president.
We're eager to be on our way to Washington.
Mr. Lincoln tell you to tell us this?
It says securing peace for our two countries, and it goes on like that.
I don't know what
There's just one country. You and I were citizens of that country. I'm fighting to protect it from armed rebels. From you.
Mr. Blair, he told us. He told President Jefferson Davis that we were
A private citizen like Preston Blair can say what he pleases since he has no authority over anything. If you want to discuss peace with President Lincoln, consider revisions.
If we're not to discuss the truce between warring nations, what in heaven's name can we discuss?
Terms of surrender.
My guest today is Dr. Ronald White. He attended Northwestern University and is a graduate of UCLA and the Princeton Theological Seminary, earning a PhD from Princeton University. He has taught at UCLA, Whitworth University, Colorado College, and the Princeton Theological Seminary. Professor White is the New York Times best-selling author of the presidential biographies A. Lincoln, A Biography, and American Ulysses, A Life of Ulysses S. Grant. USA Today said, if you read one book on Lincoln, make it A. Lincoln. And his biography on Grant won the William Henry Seward Award for Excellence in Civil War Biography. And that will be our topic of discussion today. White is also the author of Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the Second Inaugural, honored as a New York Times notable book and a Washington Post bestseller, and The Eloquent President, a portrait of Lincoln through his own words, which was published in 2005 and was a Los Angeles Times bestseller. White's essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Christian Science Monitor, and Harper's. He has lectured at the White House and been interviewed for the PBS NewsHour. He has spoken on behalf of the United States on Lincoln in England, France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and New Zealand. But back to Ulysses S. Grant. Of American Ulysses, the Chicago Tribune writes, superb, illuminating, inspiring, and deeply moving. Ronald White has done yeoman's work to restore this good man to the American memory, and in the process has done our country a great and timely service. And we are extremely fortunate to have the award-winning New York Times best-selling author with us today. Welcome, Professor White.
Good to be with you, Rob. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm really interested in the cover of American Ulysses. It's such a striking picture of Ulysses S. Grant.
Yes, I don't take credit for the cover. This is the designer at Random House. But as they had read my book and understood that I was trying to get into the soul of the man, who is the man really? He's kind of a person not necessarily easy to get inside of. They this photograph, which they colorized, if you look carefully at it, you're kind of looking deep into his eyes. That's the purpose of the cover, to try to we can get into the interior of this man, often called by others as kind of a sphinx-like character who could be quiet, not an extrovert, I argue, but a deep person.
Well, there's a real sense of purpose in that, in his look.
Yes, there is. That's a good point, too. A sense of purpose. That's a good way to describe it, yes.
Professor White, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, in honor of the great American general and president Ulysses S. Grant, we have Yulee's Dark Oatmeal Stout from the Galena Brewing Company of picturesque Galena, Illinois. Galena was the first mineral rush city in the United States in the 1820s, and it grew rapidly as the regional capital of lead mining. It was also a large riverboat port that had many prominent breweries, but Prohibition ended that production. But today, Galena Brewing Company has returned the city of Galena as a destination for great beer. So if you find yourself in the beautiful river town of Galena, go try one of their great beers. This is also my time to remind you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get new material immediately after it is published. As we've said many times, subscribing is the only way to get new shows right away. And to our ever-expanding list of supporters and listeners from 50 countries and hundreds of cities across America, I would like to say thank you. And now, I hold my beverage very high, and in the honor of a true American hero, Ulysses S. Grant, I say cheers. Grant said in his memoirs, "My family is American and has been for generations, in all of its branches, direct and collateral." This quote is at the beginning of Chapter 1 of the book American Ulysses. What does he mean by that quote, and what were the early years of Ulysses S. Grant like?
Well, I think what he meant and what I was attempting to say is that especially in recent years, we have so, to me, overemphasized individualism as if we have created ourselves. And one thing I appreciate about Grant was he was very conscious of those Grants who came before him. The first Grants came over across the Atlantic in a 71-day adventure, arriving in Massachusetts. And the very first Grant, Matthew Grant, who arrived in 1630, was called by a historian of the next generation, Honest Matthew Grant. And I thought, well, that's a great description of Ulysses, Honest Ulysses Grant. So he wanted, I think, to emphasize that it wasn't just he. People were obviously touting him as a self-made man, but that he wanted to say, I'm part of a long family tradition here in America. He then grew up on what was then the frontier. The west would have been Ohio, 55 miles east of Cincinnati, in a very rustic sort of setting. Education not the best. His father did send him twice to private schools to try to advance what was only offered in his town there in Ohio. So when he finally goes off to West Point, he really doesn't have the kind of education that many other boys had who were coming from the east or even from the south.
So Grant's father, as you mentioned, does maneuver to get Ulysses an appointment at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. There's several changes in Ulysses during that time, including his name. There are real strengths, though, demonstrated, I think, at West Point by Ulysses S. Grant. He's a better student than he's given credit for, even though, obviously, he doesn't graduate at the top of his class. Many people didn't even graduate at all.
Yes, Rob. Yeah, you make a very good point. I spent 1 week at West Point research for this book, trying to understand what it would have meant for a 17-year-old boy to come from Ohio. You're right, he doesn't graduate high, 22nd out of 39. Many dropped out, but 39 was not the number that entered. And his father wanted to go there. Basically, it was a free education. It was actually really almost an engineering school, and there were no compulsory years of service in the military once one graduated. So as the railroads started coming in, others would forsake their military career and get much higher paying jobs. So Grant was not a good student in mathematics or the engineering or science classes. He said in his memoirs, I must apologize. I thought, well, why did he apologize? Well, he said, I spent most of my time reading novels. Then I sort of explored what was in the library, and they didn't have any novels. Novels, especially American novels coming in, were kind of viewed as cheap, and people didn't quite understand yet the value of novels. And I believe that his reading of novels kind of expanded his horizons as to who he could be and what he might become.
One thing that he does demonstrate is his prowess as a horseman. In your book, you mentioned one particular record, I believe, that he sets, but that's one thing he demonstrates at West Point.
He does, and I try to make the point in the book that, for people living in the 21st century, it's very hard to appreciate what it meant to people in the 19th century that one had terrific prowess with horses. not simply to strong-arm them, but to gentle them. So he already was a great horseman growing up as a boy in Ohio. When he comes to West Point, only during his 4 years there do they really put in a set of courses on horses. And so in the final graduation, the ringmaster or quartermaster there has all the boys in the graduating class of 1843 do an exercise together, and then he calls out Cadet Grant. And fortunately, a person who was applying to be a freshman at West Point in his diary records what happens. And so Grant gets astride this huge horse, Thunder, which many of the boys were afraid to ride, and the ringmaster goes over and raises the bar 1 foot. And then Grant thunders down in that indoor arena and leaps over that bar, setting a record that would stay for 25 years. I thought that sort of pictured the horsemanship of Grant.
Would you comment on the artistic and literary sides of Grant? He doesn't normally get the credit he deserves for those attributes either.
He doesn't, and he actually lists in his memoirs all of the various novelists that he reads. Sir Walter Scott was a great novelist of the day from across the Atlantic, but James Fenimore Cooper, maybe you might call him the first great American novelist. He lists them all. And even at the end of his 4 years at West Point, he's trying to get the 2 more novels to read, and he writes off to the publisher, and within 2 weeks he hasn't heard anything, so he writes again and says, I'm eager to read these. So when I said they weren't in the library, what the boys did was they put together their own informal lending library, and then each of them would order books, and then they'd pass them around. You also mentioned his artistic ability. So this was quite something that he developed, and we have some of his paintings, which his sensitivity to how he paints both human beings and animals, his sensitivity to color. There was a great artist on the faculty there at West Point. And again, these are sides of Grant that I wanted to lift up because I think, as you suggest, they're often not the sides of Grant that we have been reading about in traditional biographies.
I think sometimes horses are also the subject of his paintings, if I'm not mistaken.
They are the subject of the paintings, yes. Grant's love affair with horses and his ability to just kind of get exactly the right shape and color and texture. You can see his great bonding with horses, which will come through in the war with Mexico and in the Civil War. He would ultimately have a number of horses. When he was president, he had a number of horses at the White House. He was a great horseman.
He graduates from West Point. He gets stationed at Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis. And although eventually he'll become a great general and American president, but I think the most important thing in his life actually occurs during that time. He meets Julia Dent.
He does. And as I looked at this whole story of Grant, I felt that Julia had been much unserved, that she was a remarkable person, became a remarkable partner. They had one of the great marriages, I think, in American history. Even fast forwarding to the White House, people would comment upon the fact that they'd come upon this couple holding hands like they were sophomores in love. And she was a great compliment to him. I came to the conclusion that he was an introvert and she was an extrovert. And they complemented each other. And they both loved horses. They had a lot of similar likes. We'll get to this later on, perhaps in the Civil War, but he did not want to be apart from her. She was kind of a lodestar for him. He became a terrific family man. And I think their marriage and Julia, is a very important part of this story.
Could you explain how he meets Julia and then how that relationship with his father-in-law is sometimes strained?
Yes. Well, when he came to Jefferson Barracks, he learned very quickly that the Dent family, which had a home about 12 miles from the barracks, was very welcoming to soldiers. So he went up there and just introduced himself, and they welcomed him, and he met Julia's 2 younger sisters, who quickly almost fell in love with him. And they said, our older daughter is away at school in St. Louis. So he didn't meet her at first. It was several months before he did meet her. And then it became almost love at first sight for both of them. The problem became, in a way, in those days, he wasn't simply courting Julia. He had to be courting her father, Old Man Dent. And Old Man Dent was a Southerner who was pro-slavery, who would ultimately become pro-secession. And he wasn't too sure that he wanted his daughter to meet a vagabond soldier. He would have much preferred for her to meet a businessman or a lawyer or someone with a more forward-looking career that could support his daughter. So this took quite a while. It was actually about 4 years before he and Julia actually married after they first met.
I think he's known as Colonel Dent, but he was never a colonel.
No, he was never a colonel. He adopted or acquiesced to that honorary title. He had actually originally come from Maryland before he came out to Missouri. So he loved to be called Colonel Dent, but he wasn't a colonel.
So Grant's service during the Mexican War, he serves under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. Those are two iconic American military commanders.
Yes.
What influence did each of those generals have on Grant's development as a leader and an Army officer?
Well, one of the things I found fascinating and an early kind of attribute of Grant was his ability in the war with Mexico to really look very carefully at leaders. He was not a leader yet. He was low on the totem pole. But as you suggest, he served first under Zachary Taylor and then under Winfield Scott. And he makes an interesting comparison of the two. Zachary Taylor, he says, dressed for comfort. He moved without any staff. He trusted his own eyes to size up the situation. Whereas Winfield Scott, who was often known as Fuss and Feathers, he wore a particular prescribed uniform. He traveled with a large staff. He notified people the exact hour he would come by. And so Grant admired both Taylor and Scott, and these are his words, with their opposite characteristics, both were great and successful soldiers. But then he tips his hand as to what kind of leader he admired and what kind of leader he would be. And this is his sentence: both were pleasant to serve under. Taylor was pleasant to serve with. And so Grant becomes this person of humility who's never going to be this egotistic commander, but will be very approachable and therefore very much appreciated by his men. And so I argue that he really modeled himself after Zachary Taylor.
You know, the interesting thing, Dr. White, is obviously we'll get to the Civil War, but if you compare those two iconic American generals, Grant is very similar to Zachary Taylor, and Robert E. Lee, in terms of that demeanor and presence, is similar to Winfield Scott.
I never thought about that. That's a great observation on your part. Absolutely. And of course, finally, down the road in Maddox, we will have these two men arriving. Quite different outfits, quite different demeanors. Yeah, that's a good observation, yes.
Would you explain his exit from the Army? I know he goes out west and he misses his family, especially misses Julia. He returns to St. Louis. Those are very challenging years for him right before the Civil War. He struggles mightily. He even sells wood on a St. Louis street corner just to get by. He names his farm Hardscrabble, so he even must understand his own failures during that time.
Yes, he returns from the war with Mexico, is posted to both Michigan and New York, and then is posted out west as the Army is posting soldiers to protect the settlers who are moving to Oregon and California. Julia cannot come with him. She is pregnant with their first child. It's a very arduous trip. They have to sail south, cross the Isthmus of Panama, where many people die of disease. Interestingly, I lift that episode up because his leadership is exercised there. As everybody else kind of falls apart, he steps forward and keeps people together. He then serves in both Oregon and California, but as you suggest, he misses Julia terribly. He falls into depression. It very well may be that he falls into drinking. This story is hard to finally pin down. It may be that he was about to be court-martialed by someone who he had previously met at the Jefferson Barracks. They didn't get along. And for whatever reason, I think it's more that he wants to be with Julia. he resigns from the military. Turns to Missouri. He struggles to make a living. It's not all his fault. Farming goes on sort of hard times with a worldwide depression. He tries to do real estate, and Julia kind of laughs and says he's not able to ask anybody for any money. If they say, I can't pay next month, this month he'll say, well, that'll be fine. As you suggest, he's consigned almost to selling wood on the streets of St. Louis. And then after 6 years, his father says, you can come to Galena, Illinois, where he has opened a leather goods store, but he has to serve underneath his younger brother. So yes, these are 7 challenging years, 1854 to 1861.
Isn't there one particular incident? We mentioned him selling wood on the corner in St. Louis, but he runs into, I believe, James Longstreet.
He does. James Longstreet had stood up with him at his wedding. They were very close friends at West Point. James Longstreet has gone on already to a successful career in the military. And as he's on the streets of St. Louis, Longstreet comes out and they meet each other. And Grant, I believe, is just kind of embarrassed by his state. And Longstreet says, well, first come in and let's play a game of brag, which is an early form of poker. And then Grant owes a debt to Longstreet, and Longstreet, I guess, looking at Grant's outfit and everything, so I don't need that money now. And Grant says, no, I have to give you this money. I can't live with myself if I don't. And this is a very important story because then Longstreet and Grant will not meet again until Appomattox.
So as you mentioned, Grant moves to Galena, Illinois, working under his younger brother. But then the Civil War starts. There's a real need for experienced Army officers, especially in the North. Where does he begin his service in the Civil War? Where is he stationed in those early years of the war?
Well, he wants to serve in the war. He knows that immediately, and he wants to serve at a position or a rank that he believes he's due from his previous service. So he struggles for a while to find that position. He actually travels back to Ohio. He understands that George McClellan is there, and he twice in 2 days tries to make an appointment with McClellan, and McClellan, for whatever reason, never shows up for the appointment. Things aren't going very well. Finally, he's hired to do some desk work in Springfield, Illinois, the capital of the state, and one thing leads to another. He's put in charge of a fort in Illinois. He does very, very well. The fort is finally renamed Fort Grant. So he's given a commission in the Union Army. His first battles are in Missouri, and right away he finds success, and he begins to rise actually quite rapidly within the ranks of leadership.
We have one distinction here in Quincy, where I'm from.
Yes.
He actually is ordered from Springfield to Quincy.
That's right.
So we like to say Grant entered the Civil War from Quincy.
Good. You're right.
So those early years leads up to a momentous battle, the Battle of Shiloh. In regards to that battle, Grant is criticized very harshly in the papers during that time for the casualties, a criticism that will follow him throughout the war and actually throughout history. Are those criticisms warranted?
Well, we have to obviously look at each battle by itself, but I think those criticisms, which are still, as you suggest, right there in the popular imagination, have been pretty much put aside by Civil War scholars over the last 20 or 30 years as they've compared Grant to Lee, as they've compared Grant to other Confederate generals, that, sometimes Grant was severely criticized for this. I think they're not fair. In terms of Shiloh, I think it is fair to say that Grant was surprised at Shiloh, that he did not anticipate that the Confederates would attack him as they had all of their defenses laid out. But once they are attacked on the first day and they're almost pushed back into the Tennessee River, there's a very, very famous episode where Grant cannot sleep inside this kind of hospital tent where men are having legs and arms amputated, and so Sherman finds him standing underneath a tree in the midst of pouring rain, and Sherman says to him, wow, he says, we really took it today, Grant. And Grant says, yes, but we'll lick him tomorrow. And this story kind of for many epitomizes Grant. It's no nonsense, purposeful, aggressive person, willing to go forward when others might say, well, maybe we need to retreat. Maybe we need to get reform. No, Grant's not going to retreat. He's not going to reform. He's going to go forward, and he goes forward the next day at Shiloh to win a decisive victory.
As a proud Quincyan, I have to mention Quincy General Benjamin Prentiss.
Yes.
In his relationship with Grant, often appears strained by historical accounts. Is that accurate? And does Benjamin Prentiss deserve any credit for the Union's successes at the Battle of Shiloh, even though he's famously repels several attacks, but's captured during that battle?
Well, yeah, this is a very enigmatic kind of relationship. Is it that Prentiss thought initially that he was more qualified or that he outranked Grant? And how did Grant rise so quickly to this height? Yes, you say correctly. I think Prentiss does deserve a lot of credit for his defense of the Hornets' Nest at Shiloh. Now, he ultimately has to surrender, but I believe he deserves a lot of credit. But it's hard to kind of get into what was the personalities between these two men. Why is it that it seems like they did not always get along? That's almost one of the mysteries of the Civil War in that particular moment.
I've often wondered if that relationship had been amicable or repaired if Grant, with his success as he rised, because Prentiss will return to duty later, but he doesn't gain any real recognition. I think he does have some success in Arkansas, if I'm not mistaken, but that's about it. He leaves the service before I think the war's even concluded. But if he would have had a stronger relationship with Grant, I wonder what his career would have been like.
That's a very good point, because Grant was extremely loyal to those who served with him. He knew that Sherman had a very difficult beginning months in the Civil War, and yet Grant put his trust in Sherman, and Sherman rose to be a great general, and Grant put his trust in others. These men were not really prepared for this at West Point. They were not prepared for this by the war with Mexico. And so if Grant thought that you were an able person, he didn't think Rosecrans was an able person, he would be on your side and he would be promoting you as you went up the ladder of leadership.
Grant's genius is really demonstrated at the Battle of Vicksburg in 1863. He appears to display almost everything the Army wants, even today, in its officers during that siege. He's resourceful, courageous, audacity, logistical awareness. Why do military historians and strategists still study that specific battle?
And they do. You're exactly still in kind of the officers' manuals of people studying textbook examples of how to lead a battle. If persons have been or will someday be able to go to Vicksburg, the topography of Vicksburg is absolutely amazing and very difficult to understand how that battle took place. Unfortunately, they've allowed the trees to go back up. Environmentalists don't want to cut them down, but in those days, everything had been cut down. And so Vicksburg was sitting at the top of this kind of bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. It was in many ways a kind of almost impregnable fort. People had dug themselves into caves, literally, in Vicksburg, and it was a very difficult thing. It was a long campaign. I mean, Sherman had tried to take it in December of 1862, failed, was pushed back, and Grant tried a variety of avenues of how to get in and around Vicksburg. But he combined a kind of patience with a perseverance. And finally, when he decides to go south of Vicksburg and to come not directly to Vicksburg, but to take a kind of almost a detour, he decides that he doesn't want to confront the Confederate Army at once, but he fights 5 different battles before he finally comes across, enters into a siege of Vicksburg, and on July 4th, 1863 is successful. We put so much emphasis on Gettysburg, which is very, very important, but one could easily argue that the most decisive battle was not Gettysburg, but was the victory at Vicksburg.
Well, he just has to be so dogged and tenacious. So it seems, at least at that moment, the Army had placed the right man in the right position.
They had. It's very interesting because Lincoln had experienced the failure of so many of his generals. He had either gone out in the field to meet these persons or had them come to the White House. He'd never met Grant, but he liked Grant because he was this Western man, like Lincoln, who didn't complain, who didn't overestimate the size of the enemy, who didn't ask for more than Lincoln could provide. And so the two of them, I think, had a kind of a very complementary attitudes, a culture of admiration for both of them before they ever met. Lincoln saw Grant was the man who could lead the Union to victory and ultimately would, of course, call him to lead all the Union armies.
Two of your masterworks, since you brought up Lincoln, are A. Lincoln and American Ulysses. Lincoln and Grant are compared in several different ways in areas by historians throughout history. But I'm interested in how the two men viewed marriage and family. Would you compare and contrast each man's relationship with his wife and his children?
Very good question. Mary Lincoln has suffered mightily under historians and the press. I'm not quite as critical of her as some. They had a kind of a tumultuous courtship where the courtship was broken off at one point for a few months. She was herself, somewhat like Julia, quite well educated for a young girl or a young woman in her day. They married. She became almost an advisor to him as he began his political career. In many ways, you could argue, saw his potential before he did. Then Lincoln serves one term in Congress, 1847 to 1849, and he comes back and believing that he probably may not have a future in politics because he had taken a stand against President James Polk and the war with Mexico, declaring that the Mexicans did not start this war, but the United States started the war. He then resumes his law career and is gone sometimes 180 days a year out on what was called the 8th Judicial Circuit, which was the middle part of Illinois, as large as the state of Connecticut. So I often argue that Lincoln was an absentee father, allowing his wife to be almost a single person raising only boys. So I don't give Lincoln great credit for that. And so, yes, she may have been a hard person to get along with. His young secretary, John Hay, called her the Hellcat. We can never get inside someone else's marriage, but I'm not willing to say it was a bad marriage. It may have been a marriage with some contention. Now, that seems to contrast mightily with the marriage of Ulysses and Julia, who seemed to have a very harmonious marriage, a very loving relationship, very complementary to each other, so that even during all the danger that he was facing, he wanted Julia to be with him when she could. And even after the people of Philadelphia had given them a beautiful home, she said, I don't want to live in that home. I want to live with you. And if you go to City Point, his headquarters there at the confluence of the James and the Appomattox River, you will see in quite a small cottage where he had his headquarters. This is where you would have found Julia.
I would like to make a comparison. And you had mentioned it earlier. There's a partnership in each one of those relationships, though.
Yes.
A partnership between Mary and Abraham Lincoln and a partnership between Julia and Ulysses. So in that way, both women are central to their success, either in politics or the military.
Rob, I think you make an excellent point. Say it well, that there was a partnership. And in a certain sense, if you think of the role of men and women, the gender roles in the 19th century, that the women's role was very much a home role, a personal role, kind of a moral role. The public role was only for men in the 19th century. In some ways, the partnership was somewhat unusual. Yeah.
Family seems to be, based on our conversation, very important to Ulysses S. Grant. How often, and you mentioned his location near Washington, but how often were Julia and the children with Ulysses during the Civil War?
Well, I was quite surprised at how often they were with him, especially the youngest boy. And his great concern for them, it's interesting when we think of his own education, he will be encouraging his children to learn German, to learn French. The boys went to very, very good schools, private and then colleges. The daughter did not have that advantage, but he says at one time was the best writer of the four children. So he was very, very concerned about the education of his children and very loving towards them.
Back to the military again, how would you characterize Grant's relationship with Sherman, and how important is that relationship in the eventual Union victory during the war?
Well, I found, again, this a fascinating friendship because, again, you couldn't find two people who were more opposite from each other. I mean, Grant was quiet, thoughtful, an introvert. Sherman was an extrovert, explosive, dynamic, and yet, again, there was this mutual admiration. Sherman had, early in the war, some people even thought had mental illness, and he was sort of set aside, and Grant helped bring him back into the mainstream of the Union effort. And then after Shiloh, which we've mentioned, Halleck, who is the sort of general-in-chief in Washington, says, well, I'm going to come out and take over the military as we march south towards Corinth, Mississippi. And so Grant is placed in second in command to Halleck, but no longer really commanding his own troops. And after not too long, Grant is so discouraged that he decides he's going to resign. And when Sherman hears this, he rushes over to Grant and says, listen, Grant, you helped me at one critical point in my journey, and I'm going to help you now. You cannot and you will not resign. This particular episode will pass. You've got a great future in the Army. And almost he says, I'm not going to let you resign. And so the two of them were just remarkable. And then later on, during the administration of Andrew Johnson, after the assassination of Lincoln, when Johnson realizes that his greatest rival, the popular person, is Grant, he tries to pull Sherman in to become general-in-chief of the Army or to sideline Grant, and Sherman won't let that happen. Sherman always recognized that Grant is the better of the two, and that's just fine with him. And the two of them support each other.
To the end of the war, there's a quote by Robert E. Lee, which I really like, but I'm not going to let him completely off the hook. He says, I surrendered more to Lincoln's kindness than Grant Army. And I'm paraphrasing that. Now, that gives Lincoln a lot of credit, but I don't think he's given Grant enough credit for his military prowess.
Well, I think that he doesn't have to compare himself to Lincoln with military prowess. And so here is this man, Grant, who's half a generation younger than he is, and who has defeated him. And so he's perhaps begrudging in terms of how Grant did this and what is Grant's success. You know, the whole lost cause that will come into play very quickly after the Civil War, which will lift up Lee as the great general and will suggest that the only reason the North won was that they had this overwhelming military force, they had a much greater industrial might, and they had this quote-unquote butcher Grant. And that was a way of elevating Lee, but downplaying Grant's role. Now, that's all changed in the last 30, 35 years as military historians have compared Lee and Grant, but for the longest time, that was the picture of people's understanding of Grant compared to Lee.
I've been in the Army for 27 years. I was on active duty. I'm in the reserves now. So I've been an Army officer. I've been through a lot of military training. Mm-hmm. And when I look at those two, obviously Lee is successful, but a lot of it's tactical. And sometimes people who are not in the military place an oversized emphasis on those tactical type of successes, maneuverability on the battlefield and so forth. Grant doesn't get credit. He's almost like a modern general where Robert E. Lee doesn't meet those same levels of attributes that Grant displays. He sees an overall view. He has a better logistical view. And those are all modern attributes that a general must have to be successful today.
Well, it's fascinating, Rob, that you would make that observation. One of the interesting things that's happened to me in the last few years from doing this biography has been a friendship that's developed with General David Petraeus. And General Petraeus, we've done several events together at West Point. He was a visiting professor at the University of Southern California, at the Grant Monument Association in New York City. And Petraeus argues that Grant is the greatest American general with no comparison. And he said there's three ways that you kind of look at a general. First is tactical. And in fairness, Dwight Eisenhower never had a tactical command. So that takes him out of the picture in one sense. The second is your ability to supervise multiple armies Grant is directing 5 armies at the end of the Civil War. And the third, and I'm sort of struggling to find the word that Petraeus uses, but you suggested it in your comments, that Grant has this overall, the modern general who understands even the political and the military, how they are both involved in this. He has this large strategic picture of what is happening in warfare. And that's why Petraeus says Grant is the greatest general. And that Grant's memoirs in preparing Petraeus for the surge in Iraq, and that he encouraged his own generals to read Grant as they prepared for leadership roles.
Well, my commanders also, like I was never served under General Petraeus, but they always have reading for you, Dr. White. So Grant becomes a great hero after the war. He's elected president in 1868. His administration is not always successful, though, but there are some areas where there's real achievements. It's sometimes said that as president, Grant accomplished more regarding civil rights than any president except for Lyndon Johnson. Is that a fair assessment?
It is a fair assessment, and I think as we look back at Grant, and I think this is one of the reasons Grant is rising in people's appreciation today, he very much wanted to protect the freedmen. Now, his Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, had passed under Lincoln's administration the 13th Amendment, and then would pass under the Republican Congress the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, the so-called Reconstruction Amendments. But then, as often happens, the Republican Party grew tired of defending the freedmen, and they began to adopt the attitude, well, let the South deal with the South. And so at the moment that they begin to withdraw, Grant steps forward. It's very fascinating that Grant's father was very much strongly anti-slavery, but there's no real evidence that Grant was strongly anti-slavery as a young man. I think his views on slavery developed during the Civil War as he went further and further into the South and had African-American slaves coming into Union camps. His empathy towards these people stepped forward. And then in his administration, when the Ku Klux Klan comes into being, he wants to strike out against what we would really today label a terrorist organization. But he discovers that local and state courts will do nothing to really prosecute. They will bring these Klansmen into court and then just quit them, let them go. He has to step forward. The national government, the military has to step forward if there's any way of combating the Klan. So he does so, and he earns the allegiance. Frederick Douglass, subject of the great recent biography by David Blight, is a terrific fan of Grant, campaigns for Grant in both 1868 and 1872. You could almost argue he thinks more of Grant than he does of Lincoln. So Grant deserves a great deal of credit, which was not seen for defending the freedmen. Now, why was it not seen? Because the way American history, not only in the South but in the North, Reconstruction was bad, and so the idea that one would defend the freedmen never came into view, and it only began to come into view when, during the civil rights era of the 1960s, we took a kind of fresh look at what had happened to the plight of African Americans.
One of the things I think about in terms of Grant is that Lincoln's philosophy does live on after he dies. I think that Grant is impressed by what Lincoln, not personally, but impressed by his philosophy and his thoughts. You mentioned Grant doesn't have a real view on slavery, or not a staunch view against slavery, not real political. Lincoln must impress him with those philosophies or ideas that carry on throughout his entire life.
He does, and in his memoirs, he will say, there is no one that can compare to Abraham Lincoln. Certainly he doesn't compare himself to Abraham Lincoln. But after the disastrous presidency of Andrew Johnson, I think he does understand that he wouldn't have originally thought of running for political office. But now someone, and it must be him, has to pick up the mantle and restore the vision of Lincoln, which is in danger of being lost. So I think he's very self-conscious that he wants to carry on Lincoln's vision, and that's a vision of magnanimity towards the South, and it's a vision of standing up for the rights of the freedmen.
Do you see any connection between Grant's military experience and some of the scandals? And I'll be more specific. For example, this concept of command and the delegation of authority, does it make him more liable to assume greater reliance on his peacetime staff than he should have?
I think it does. And a couple of comments about how that happens. In the Civil War, in his command and his staff, he knew these men very, very well. So I mentioned just an aside a few minutes ago that Rosecrans, who might have been voted the most likely to succeed in his graduating class from West Point, Grant took his measure and found it wanting. So he knew these men. He had a very clear understanding of their abilities or their disabilities. The men who became his cabinet officers, especially in the 19th century, were placed there because, we have to have someone from New England and we want to have someone from Illinois and we have to balance this with balance that. He didn't know a lot of these people. And you might argue that he should have taken the time to get to know them, but as you suggest, he delegated authority to them just as he had done in the military. And the whole understanding that power would corrupt in Washington, that even some of his military friends who were straight arrows, so to speak, in the military in the Civil War were also corrupted once they got into Washington. Whether Grant wasn't looking, whether his loyalty to these people didn't allow him to see. So Grant himself was never accused of any scandal, but he should bear some responsibility that these scandals took place under his watch.
Frequently, historians rank U.S. presidents. That's a favorite thing to do, and people even who don't like history will get interested in that. Not too many years ago, even in the early 2000s, Grant was ranked near the bottom because of some of the things that you mentioned with the issues in his administration. In recent years, though, admiration for Grant has risen. I think works like yours have contributed to that. He now ranks somewhere in the middle of presidential rankings. Do you think that his rise will continue and admiration for Grant will continue in the future?
Yes, C-SPAN, there's been a number of presidential surveys, but I like the C-SPAN has done 3 in the 21st century. I was privileged to participate in the 2017 Presidential Historian Survey. Grant has risen 11 places just in the 21st century. And that includes, now including 2 21st century presidents, George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And if you look at the various characteristics by which we're supposed to rank presidents, Grant ranks within the top 10. I think he should rank higher, precisely because of his defense of the freedmen. So it very well may be that Grant will continue to rise as we take a more balanced view of his accomplishments as president.
Some scholars suggest that Fred Grant or Mark Twain or others wrote portions of his memoirs, which are famous. What is the story behind the writing and publishing of those memoirs?
Grant wrote his memoirs. Mark Twain published them. Grant was never intending to write his memoirs. He thought that they were self-serving, they were egotistical, they were settling old scores. But then he is diagnosed with throat cancer, and he realizes that this is terminal, and he's asking himself the question, how in the world is he going to support Julia? There are no presidential pensions until way into the 20th century. And so the Century magazine had put together a series of volumes called Battles and Leaders, in which they asked Confederate and Union generals to write essays on particular battles. So Grant wrote 4 essays for which they paid him $500 each. They then approached him and said, we would like now for you to publish your memoir, and we will pay you $10,000 for the memoir. Well, Mark Twain hears about this. He is a great fan of Grant. He rushes over to Grant's home in New York, and he says, or at least he remembers himself saying, paying $10,000 is what you would pay an Indian to write, pardon me, the language of a memoir. You should receive so much more. So he ends up offering Grant 70%. Most people would have, in those days, would receive an honorarium of 10% for writing a memoir. He said, I'll give you 70% of the total proceeds for the memoirs. And so Grant signs on with Twain's new publishing company. He writes his own memoirs. He uses his oldest son, Fred, as kind of a reference librarian, bringing to him all of the records by which he can do so. He is slowly sinking towards death, losing weight. Finally, towards the end, Twain hires a stenographer so that Grant can dictate his memoirs. And then by the early 1885, he can no longer speak. So Grant writes out some of his ideas on little slips of paper. I've held those slips of paper in my hand at the Library of Congress. And his doctors say he only lived to complete the memoirs. He dies 3 days after he finishes the last word of the memoirs. The memoirs will earn Julia $450,000 of 19th century money.
In Grant's funeral procession, there are officers from both the U.S. Army and the Confederacy serving as pallbearers: Sherman, Sheridan, Johnston, Buckner. It is said that Grant requested that arrangement. What does that say about Grant's philosophy and character?
Yes, this says that there was great admiration by Union and Confederate leaders for Ulysses S. Grant. Huge funeral procession, more than 500,000 people that day in 1885, which suggests how much Grant was not simply admired, but in a very real sense loved by the American people of his day.
I'd like to wrap up our conversation today with a quote from his friend, Confederate General James Longstreet. He's quoted as saying, "He was a great general, but the best thing about him was his heart." What do you think that Longstreet is referring to, and is that probably a fitting way to end our discussion on Grant today?
I think it's very fitting, and Longstreet says something quite similar when it appears to Robert E. Lee that the battle is lost, that he will have to consider surrendering, and Lee sort of says, "I'm very worried about the terms that will be given to our Confederate side." And Longstreet at that moment replies to Lee something to the same effect. You need not have any worry when you're dealing with General Grant. You're going to be dealing with a person of heart, you could almost say of magnanimity. And so Longstreet, who had known Grant as a young cadet at West Point, really understood who this man was, deeply admired him, and caught the kind of soul of the man, circling back to the early first discussion on the cover, that this was a man of deep wells, of deep integrity and truthfulness, and Longstreet admired him greatly.
I'd like to pay you a compliment, Professor White. When I was at the Quincy University, we had a professor. His name was Father Aaron Pendleton. He was one of my mentors. He's passed away now, actually several years ago. But when I hear your voice, it has a similar tone, and it's got a sincerity to it, a kindness to it. And I just wanted to tell you through our conversation today, it reminded me of Father Aaron, and that was kind of important for me. It's kind of personal, but it's a compliment I'd like to pay to you.
Well, you're very kind in saying so. Thank you so much. It's been a marvelous conversation with you and all the ways that you've prompted our conversation together. I very much appreciate it.
Thanks, Dr. White. I appreciate it. I really do.
Thank you.
I would like to thank my guest today, renowned presidential historian and New York Times best-selling author, Dr. Ronald White. And if you would like to get his book, American Ulysses, just click on the link in the description below. For the lovers of American history out there, this book is a must for your collection. The featured brew was Yuli's Dark Oatmeal Stout from the Galena Brewing Company of beautiful Galena, Illinois, the former home of Ulysses S. Grant himself. If you like this talk today, please share the episode with a friend. All of the directories have a great sharing function. And remember, subscribe to the podcast. As we mentioned in the beginning, subscribing is the only way to get new shows right away. The music was provided by the great band Bones Fork. And to our growing list of listeners and supporters from 50 countries and hundreds of cities across the United States, I would like to say once again, thank you. There are several great episodes on the way with discussions on the warrior chief Tecumseh, the Manhattan Project, the Mosquito, JFK versus Dulles, and the history of the University of Notre Dame. So wake up the echoes and join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Once he surrenders, send his boys back to their homes, their farms, their shops.
Yes, sir. As we discussed.
Liberality all around, not punishment. I don't want that. And the leaders, Jeff and the rest of them, if they escape, leave the country while my back's turned, that wouldn't upset me none. When peace comes, it mustn't just be hangings.
By outward appearance, you're 10 years older than you were a year ago.
Some weariness has bit at my bones. I've never seen the like of it before, what I've seen today. Never seen the like of it before.
You always knew that. What this was going to be. Intimate and ugly. You must have needed to see it close when you decided to come down here.
We've made it possible for one another to do terrible things.
We've won the war. Now, you have to lead us out of it.